Hey, good afternoon everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Got a nice little gray day going on. Temperature's perfect, about the mid 70s. All systems are fully charged already, so just working on a surplus of energy right now. And I was just going to talk to you today about my top 5 considerations of things to think about before you would move off the beaten path, whether you're getting out of the city into a more rural area. And the things that I considered when I first started this adventure 30 years ago, how it's developed over the past 30 years, and if some of those things still hold true. So for me, it was really easy when I decided to leave the big city. I knew, and always knew since I was a kid, that I wanted to move up into the mountains and be a mountain man. So that was always the dream for me. And that's where I knew I was always going to go. And so for the number one consideration was what type of land to purchase. So I knew I wanted to find some mountain land, rural, off the beaten path, no grid anywhere near it. I wanted to go where it was absolutely quiet and peaceful and relatively no people. And I was lucky enough to find that in the southern Colorado mountains 30 years ago. And when I first purchased a 7.5 acre piece of ground, the cost was, they wanted $5,000 for that. I offered them $4,500 and they took it. So I was on my way with that. I didn't have a lot of foresight about what I was going to do, other than I knew I was going to go into the mountains, build my own cabin, and start from there. And I was young and strong and confident in all of my abilities back then, and knew that I could make it work. So yeah, my first consideration was, of course, the type of ground that I wanted. And then tied into that was how much money did I have to work with, which at the time was $5,000. And then I started with my piece of ground, and I would go down there on weekends as often as I could, eventually put a little trailer out there. Still hadn't made the jump to living 100% of my time down there, but always knew that with that piece of ground that eventually I would get down there, and within a couple of years I was able to do that. So yeah, the first consideration was where I wanted to go. I was very clear on that. It was heading to the mountains, and then, like I said, with a certain amount of money to work with to purchase my first piece of land. And then second, I would say on that list would be, what kind of neighbors would you be moving in close to? Now, I was lucky enough when I moved into those Colorado mountains, there was really no neighbors. In fact, the only year-round resident that was anywhere near me at the time was 1 mile away. So I felt that was a good enough buffer zone at that time. Now, of course, over the years, those things change, and more people start moving in, of course. But for the most of my tenure up in the mountains, I really didn't have any nearby neighbors. They got closer and closer over time, but that's one thing that I would also say really consider, is what kind of neighbors. The other thing that ties into that is, before you purchase the land, I would say go out there at various times of the day, and especially at night, and sit out there at night and listen to the sounds that it produces at night. And that'll really give you a good idea of any nearby neighbors. Now, like I said, my first neighbor was over 1 mile away. I did go out there at night just to sit on the property, and it was nothing but the sounds of wilderness. So I was sold on that. And I just couldn't foresee that changing anytime soon. But over the next 15 years, like I said, more and more people would start to move in, get a little bit closer. And in rural situations, I have found this to be true no matter where you live. Everybody wants to be the last person in. So when you buy your property and you're surrounded by thousands and thousands of wilderness acres, even if someone moves within a half mile of you, it starts to feel pretty close when you're used to no sounds other than nature. So you can start to hear a car come up a road, or they might be shooting their guns off, whatever, or running a generator. These are all things that I would strongly suggest that you listen to the sounds of the piece of property that you plan on buying, and especially at night. Go out there at night and sit there. If you can, camp out on it all night long and see what you're getting involved in. And I was real lucky on that first piece of ground because it was really wilderness back then. Nobody around there, which is exactly what I was looking for. So I quickly purchased that land. So I only knew that I was going to go down there and build my own cabin. I hadn't thought about things like water, which would be my number 3 thing to consider. Where are you going to get your water from? But I didn't even give that much consideration up there because, well, it got a ton of snow up there, and I was close enough to a nearby town about 10 miles away that had a community well at the time. And that community well served all the people living out in the mountains, deep in the mountains, and you could drive up there with your truck. And at the time I had a 200-gallon water tank in the back of my truck, which lasted me a very long time. And I could go into that community well, leave a few dollars donation, and fill up my 200 gallons of water and drive it back up to my property. So that's how I remedied the water situation. Then over a few years, I don't remember now exactly how long, I'll say it was about, I'd been in the mountains 6 or 7 years probably, depending on that community well, as well as many other people that I knew. We all depended on that community well. We all contributed to it. And then there was a change in the local government, and the powers that be decided to shut down that well, which that made a lot of people have to move out of the mountains. I wasn't going to do that, and so I had to come up with a different way to make sure I had water. And so I built a little water catchment system, but in Colorado at the time, and I believe it's still the way, it was illegal to catch water and store it for your own use. They claimed rights to every raindrop that fell on your roof. I haven't heard of that changing back in there, but I don't know that to be a fact. But we caught rainwater anyway, breaking the law. And then a few years later, I was able to save up enough money and drill a well. So if you're getting ready to head off whatever kind of ground you get, you're going to have to consider water, and where are you going to get water, and how sustainable is that going to be, because you can't live up anywhere without water. So that's big on the list. And like I said, I had no indication that that water source would have been turned off at the tap, literally. And it just made me have to shift gears a little bit. And so I had to catch water illegally for a few years and did just fine with that. Got enough rain at the time, had a little cistern, and I caught water enough to sustain life at 9,000 feet in the Rockies. So those are 3 things to really consider. How much money do you have to work with to get your piece of ground? What kind of ground do you want? Are you heading to the mountains? Are you heading to the desert? Regardless of where you're heading, you're going to need water. And then again, on that list, what kind of neighbors are you going to have? Because rural areas in general, I will say, don't spread their arms and bring the cookies over to you when you move into the neighborhood. They're real standoffish, you're coming into area that they've considered basically their kind of area before you came in there. Where I was at in the mountains, it was real popular hunting grounds. So it rubbed some of the people the wrong way that I was in their prime hunting area. So those are all things you need to consider. And then once you are well established and have dropped anchor wherever you are, you will feel the same way when someone starts to encroach upon you, no matter how close that is. If they become your nearest neighbor and it's a half a mile away, it's going to feel too close. And if it's on the lot next door, it feels way too close. So really, those are some very important considerations. And then fourth on that list, I think I would say, how are you going to survive out there? What will you make money? You're going to need some money. Unless you just have tons of money, which I never did, you're going to need to make a living out there. Now, like I said, I was young and strong and very confident in my abilities, worked with my hands, always figured there'd be a way to eke out some kind of a living using my hands as a therapist, which I have done for the past 30 years as well. So, although I wasn't able to make the same kind of income up in that rural area as I did in the city with my hands, over the years, people would actually drive all the way up to see me if they needed to get off some crutches, couldn't walk, whatever, couldn't turn their head. I could help them with that. So I was able to do okay. It wasn't great just because there was not a lot of people up there. But over the years, I developed a small, steady stream of income and developed a pretty consistent clientele. But yeah, it wasn't as much money. So you want to consider that too. So that'd be like number 4 on my list, unless you are independently wealthy or retired with a guaranteed income and you're just young and full of spunk like I was, you're going to have to consider how you're going to make some money in the area you are. And the further you are away from civilization, that may be harder. Now, of course, now with the internet, which was not happening at all when I first went off grid, a lot more people are moving off grid. You can get your internet through satellite anywhere, and that allows a lot of people to live way off the beaten path and still make a living. The digital nomad era is well upon us. So that's different these days, and that may be something a lot of you will be able to do, is make your living off the internet in some kind of a way, whatever your specialty might be. And then number 5 on my list, and again, I'm just going over the top 5 things that I think people need to consider if they're going to take the big step, move 100% off grid, live full time. And the other thing is heating and cooling. And then, of course, that ties right into power. So again, when I started 30 years ago, all I wanted to do was build a little cabin in the mountains. I wasn't thinking about solar power. I was thinking more about sitting there reading books, which is what I did for a very long time. And then, I went by a little solar shop, saw a little solar panel and a little battery, and then I got a little TV and VCR so I could, in between reading books, I could watch a movie if I felt like it. And I was thrilled with that. One little solar panel, one little 12-volt TV VCR combo. And at that time, I thought that's all I'd ever need. So it changes the longer you're off-grid. And of course, now the technology with all of the off-grid solar supplies and batteries has changed so fast, and everything is so much better and so much cheaper that a lot more people are thinking about moving off grid. Now out here on the big island of Hawaii, in the past couple of years, there's been exponential growth out in this area over the pandemic. Tons more people started moving out into this area. I believe they're running up against a lot of the same things that I did when I first went out into the mountains. You know, they're thinking about all those things. How are they going to make a living? Of course, water is obtained out here. You can catch rainwater. Everyone living off grid has to rely on rainwater catchment. We all do. We do pretty well with that. I've shared with you sometimes when it gets a little drier, you have to conserve a little bit, but you can build a big enough cistern to pretty much carry you through any condition and have enough water out here. So water isn't quite the issue that it was up in the mountains of Colorado, but I mean, it's still an issue. You have to pay attention to how much water you're using. And then the power thing, especially if you're in a very, very hot climate, you're going to have something to cool you down. So then, you know, you're going to need some solar. Hopefully you won't rely on a generator, but lots of people, including myself, we all have a generator for backup. I haven't fired mine up in months, and I don't plan on doing it, but in a pinch, it can get you through a couple of days if need be. So, you know, and I'm lucky in this climate here. I'm at the right elevation in the tropics to not need air conditioning. And a lot of you guys have asked me that over the past couple of years. You know, what do I do for air conditioning? I don't need it here. It's high enough in elevation that it stays pretty temperate year round. We do get a few hot days where you just lay low in the shade, but most often there are days like today, it's in the mid 70s and doing just fine. And then on the same token here, I don't need any heating. It doesn't get cold enough to need any kind of heat in the house. So, you know, the lowest temperatures that I see here in the wintertime, occasionally it'll drop down into the 50s. Mostly it stays in the 60s. And then this time of year, you know, the evening closer to high 60s, low 70s even. So it's better for older age out here, I'll say that. And then at 9,000 feet in the Rockies, relied on a potbelly stove and cut dead standing beetle killed pine. And the routine was to get about 8 cords stacked up to get through the winter. So that was a lot of work involved, but I enjoyed that kind of work at the time. Always got our winter's wood stacked up in the fall and burned a lot of wood in a wood stove for heat. And we could even cook on that a little bit, but we used a lot of propane up there for cooking. So those would be my top 5 things to consider if you guys are ever thinking about getting off the beaten path. You know, what kind of land do you want? Where do you want to go? How much money do you have to work with? I call that number 1. Number 2, the neighbor situation. Real consideration to think about. You know, I looked at a lot of property out here before I purchased this property. And again, when I purchased this 15 years ago out here, there was not very many people on this stretch of road that I'm living on now. There are quite a few more people now, and that brings a lot more noise, which to me, the greatest thing and the thing I have always sought out in living in nature is the quiet. For me, that is the number 1 reason to live off grid for me personally. I like quiet, and that's a hard thing to find anymore. So yeah, so the neighbors, the water, how you're gonna make some money, and how you're gonna keep your body comfortable, whether it's heat or cooling. If you got all that figured out and you really want to do it, you know, I say go for it. I've never looked back. I'm happy I did it. I got to be a mountain man for 15 years. Enjoyed the heck out of it. And now I don't know what to call myself other than comfortable. I'm not chopping wood, but I'm still happy to be off grid. And those would be my top 5 considerations. Aloha, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.